episode, an English episode of my podcast, Magic Brain Kicks. And as you know, I like to connect to several brains, to other brains, especially to special, impressive brains. And today I invited a very special brain, a Harvard brain, I would say. And we met at an event of Heinrich Böll Foundation about cyberpunks, Bitcoin, blockchain, AI, and all this new stuff, I would say. And yes, I invited Dr. Nakeema Stefflbauer. It's a wonderful international name, I would say. Welcome. And your CV is so impressive. Dr. Nakeema Stefflbauer, I want to read it, holds a MI and a PhD degrees from Harvard University in Modern Middle East History.
That's correct.
and a BA from Brown University and an Executive MBA from the disruptive Quantic School of Business and Technology. And her background in research, technology, transformation and social entrepreneurship leverage a network that stretches from Harvard through Europe and the MENA region, that's Northern America, Africa and Middle East. What I love most is that you come from Brooklyn. Because I stayed there, or I lived there for 3 months. Mm-hmm. And yes, and therefore my first question, of course, is how was it to grow up in Brooklyn, and why do you decide to study modern Middle East history?
Wow. Well, luckily the two are very tightly connected, I would say. How was it to grow up in Brooklyn? I grew up in Brooklyn at a time when it was very different than it is today. I think the best way to describe growing up in Brooklyn is that it was tough, because it was. Mm-hmm. It's not the Brooklyn of today. It was the Brooklyn of the 70s and 80s, which was just coming out of bankruptcy. Yeah. It was coming out of lots of racial tension and clashes and blackouts and the civil rights movement, the aftermath of the civil rights movement. And I think for people like my parents, who were both immigrants from Jamaica and from Panama, mm-hmm. it was a moment when they got to New York and then Brooklyn, where there seemed to be lots of opportunity to change the way that things had been working in the past. The 60s were really transformational, as were a lot of the 70s. At that time. And, you know, we had so much tension between, I think it's known as the bridge and tunnel connection, right? So mm-hmm. you have Manhattan, which was the center of everything, and the boroughs, so Queens, Brooklyn, the Bronx, Staten Island, and
yes,
you had to take a bridge or a tunnel to get, this was the saying, you know, to get to sort of the city. Mm-hmm. Where all the action was happening. And so growing up in Brooklyn at that time was very much, you know, you felt that you were peripheral to the action and things that were happening, which was all in Manhattan. And having grown up and been educated in Brooklyn at public schools until high school, mm-hmm. Which was private school and on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, that changed my worldview so completely that I was able to sort of focus on university. Mm-hmm. I was able to sort of understand what the hierarchies were in terms of state versus private versus Ivy League universities. And when I left for college in Rhode Island to go to Brown University, for me it was eye-opening, not so much to be there and to interact with the other students, but to come back. And so to come back to Brooklyn and realize that it was still the place that was fighting with, you know, the depictions of Tom Wolfe's Bonfire of the Vanities. You know, it was that kind of space still. It was fighting with Bernie Goetz's shooting up teenagers on the subway because, it's so scary, you know, and they're black and he's white, and what do you do if you are afraid of being victimized, which everyone was, to be fair, at that time, by anyone.
Yep.
And the newspapers made it worse, and so, you know, this was a time where you had Donald Trump coming out of nowhere and being quite ridiculous, but having these over-the-top, garish real estate, you know, developments. And at the same time, you had you had the Central Park Five being depicted as the worst thing ever to happen to the country. So navigating that was exhausting, and it was stressful, and it was really something that I would rather have been anywhere else than in order to not deal with it. And among the things I discovered when attending Brown University was that study abroad was a thing. Most people studied abroad in Europe or in Africa for various reasons, and I couldn't afford either. So I was a scholarship student. There was no chance that I was going to go and study abroad and have that be covered by my scholarship. But I could do research grants, and there were ways of having shorter term overseas experiences. And I quickly found out that among the places I could afford were North Africa. And that was something I got interested in over the course of studying nationalism, the growth of nationalism, which of course was not focused on the US, where we don't study those things, but was focused on Algeria and Tunisia and Morocco and the whole Maghreb and then Pan-Arab movements. And so once I got into that, and I discovered that there was a way that I could string together a study opportunity and a grant and a language component, I was off to Tunisia. And that's where it started for me. And it's only by luck and chance that I didn't end up going to Algeria at that time, because it was in the summer of 1991. And that was the point at which the Yugoslavian conflict just kind of exploded. And it was also the time when the Islamic Front was elected in Algeria, and then they quickly rejected the results, and it became a long-running conflict. So I luckily decided, maybe I won't take the train over to Algiers and see what's going on. But I did get the bug. I did get the sense that, the reinvention opportunity of going to a country I didn't know, speaking two languages one that I thought I knew, which was French, and the other that was brand new, which was Arabic, was just a much more achievable dream than going back home to Brooklyn and trying to achieve something when there are Donald Trumps that are building $1 million buildings, and there are people with hereditary wealth who are not possible to compete with. So my interest was, how can I just be seen and be human and connect with other humans at an individual level without this constant overshadowing of race and class and money. And Tunisia allowed me to do that.
Okay, yes. And this was although, you researched for the PhD then, and then what was the next step?
There were many steps after Tunisia. They led me to Egypt after that, where I lived for a year between university and graduate school. I went into graduate school thinking I was going to be looking at North African migration, and I had then spent a summer in Morocco and learned at every stage the local dialects of the countries that I was visiting. But by the time I got to master's level and I was thinking about a thesis, I started to be more interested in the eastern Levantine states. And at that time, Syria was stable, Lebanon was a mess. And I was looking into the wartime conditions and the civil war in Lebanon and sort of the relationship between Syria, which had always been kind of boring and staid and more aligned with the USSR, and its former economic union with Egypt and these kinds of things. And then I basically, took myself over to see what I could actually do on the ground doing research and interviews. And I discovered what, a police state looks like from the inside, and how it is to be unable to get people to open up and talk to you because they're afraid and because they're being monitored and they're being controlled. And next door, the country that's known as a disaster and a failed state, and it's just, a free-for-all, is actually a much better place to do research if you're careful, because you can't shut people up in Lebanon talking about politics. I mean, they're very opinionated, they're very active, and there are lots and lots of people across the entire political spectrum who value very much having a new outside person to win over. So that's how I started to look at black market trade and to do the interviews and to put together the research that became my doctoral thesis.
And then you do know all these tech thing. What was the inspiration or motivation to change from this very interesting part to the tech industry?
Well, it was a little bit like Cinderella after the ball, right? I mean, I came back from this exciting research and these connections and these aspirations to do this kind of work in either academia, which was what I knew up to that point, or in the UN in a more diplomatic capacity, or in business, which seemed interesting if I could connect it to the regions that I liked. And there were no takers. It was 1999, and there was literally no reason anyone in New York could imagine that they should care about that part of the world. Universities thought, Middle East studies are interesting from an ancient, Near Eastern history kind of perspective, which, by the way, is dominated by Germans for the most part.
Okay, so I didn't know that.
Most of the Arabists who were at the time kind of most respected and entrenched in academia were Germans. So older Germans in most cases. So I was having a really hard time reconciling the time and the energy that I'd put into these specialist studies with what everyone around me was interested in, which was the future. And so I had many, many, many interactions while I was writing my dissertation, living in New York and working as a temp, which is a temporary worker in various corporate offices in New York City during the day, and hearing about, technology and websites and, e-commerce wasn't the thing, but websites were, chat rooms were, messenger services on America Online were at the time. And I started to think that maybe I needed to be open to something different than what I had studied. And when I got the opportunity to get into e-learning and an e-learning company, Click to Learn, I decided I would go for that. I would study up. I would talk to everyone I knew who seemed to know something about transitioning their own studies. I knew some electrical engineers and computer science majors who had made the leap into web development. And I got as much information as I could from them about how they did it. And that helped me to get into this initial role in software project management. And then I got certified, and then I kind of moved on from there in always working with web development teams, quality assurance. Nothing was specialized at the time in terms of the roles. But then in a client-facing capacity, I was almost always put in the situation of then quantifying, structuring, and documenting what were the client requirements that we could deliver based on the constraints of the technologies we were working with, what were the concerns of the technical teams of delivering these new products online to businesses that didn't necessarily have any understanding of the technical constraints, and how to motivate and engage with both sides so that we could get these things delivered and done. And that's what I've been doing ever since then. Pretty much.
It's very interesting because, yes, you were open for the future, and that's, of course, our issue today, to be open for the future and to include all these different culture things, these different minds to the new future, especially in the digitalization way or in the AI or whatever you think about that. And it's very interesting for me to hear how you connect all these things. And now you are in Berlin, and you founded the Frauenloop. And of course, what was the next step after the technical, science, learning, and so on? You always lived in the US or in New York, and then you come to Europe, or what was the next step?
No, so one of the things I did before I started the technical transition with Click to Learn and e-learning, I moved to Chicago for a year, and I lived there for, I think, a year exactly to the day. So that tells you how well that went. Moved back to New York and started with Click, and then moved to Toronto, Canada. So I'd spent 4.5 years in Canada and actually immigrated there and went through the whole process and got, permanent residence and all of this.
You want to be a Canadian?
I didn't get the nationality because I didn't apply for it. But although I'm eligible, actually the whole family's eligible to become Canadian. But at the time, I couldn't have dual nationality. I still can't as an American. And my partner can't or couldn't at the time as an Austrian national. And it seemed like too much work for my kids. So, who already had dual Austrian U.S. citizenship. So, we were there in political protest in large part. We were there looking for an alternate, situation that was a bit more open and tolerant and polite than the U.S., our experience of the U.S. was after 9/11, which was 3 blocks from our house when it happened.
Oh, wow.
So, and we were at home. So that was, I think, still a reaction to going through the wholesale shift of nobody cares, nobody's interested, the middleware, what, who cares, to who knows someone who can tell us about Saudi Arabia? Where is Saudi Arabia? What is going on? Why do they hate it? And suddenly everything and everyone is focused on the Middle East, but a depiction of the Middle East that bears no relation to the place that, I spent a decade traveling and connecting with people. And so that was very hard. And I think Toronto for us was very much a reaction to that and a response to the sense that there was very little interest in the public media in understanding people and understanding cultures, and there was very little room for people who did to operate and share their knowledge at that time. So that went on for 4.5 years. After that, moved back to the States, but this time back to almost Harvard. We moved to Brookline, which is a suburb, semi-suburb of Boston, and it's just, there's, Brookline, Somerville, Allston, Cambridge. So it's very close to where I spent 6 years as a Harvard student, and it has an excellent public school system, and it's quite diverse in the sense that people from all over the world are attending or teaching at the 50-plus colleges and universities in the Boston area. Biotech was huge and still is huge in the Boston corridor towns and spaces. Obviously, the main research universities are there. So that was a bit our safety, even though we're not New Englanders. It wasn't kind of, I'm always going to be a Brooklynite, but there was a bit of the sense that at least there we will have this very highly educated and global population, and it won't be so hard to juxtapose the interests and focus that I spent so long working on with what's happening in the public and in the media. But then we got restless because the whole Middle East essentially collapsed. A lot of the places that I cared about and that I was deeply invested in tracking what was happening and seeing how those stories would be replayed and described outside of the Middle East and North Africa, a lot of those places started to crumble, and I was shocked by how distant and how isolated I felt like living in the U.S. was by that time. And having lived through 9/11, where it genuinely was a shock for most people who had no knowledge of what was happening in the Middle East, I felt really exposed. I felt like living in a vacuum where there's no news about North African countries. There's very little news about the Middle East and the Gulf, while 30-year, 28-year, multi-decade governments are crumbling is not the best place to be or the most secure place to be because, anything can happen and it will take us by surprise. So we started thinking about moving closer to Europe where there is more, we hoped, there is more exchange, there is more connection, there is more curiosity, at least, about what was happening in these other parts of the world. And we visited Berlin back in the late 90s, and we loved it, but there was no tech scene. So we checked it out again. We checked it out again in 2010 or 11 is when we started. And every year we would come and spend a few weeks and see how things would work and who was hiring and who was coming and how these startup companies were doing. And by 2013, it was possible for us to just wholesale move everything and everyone and get going.
Okay.
So here we are.
You are now here, yes. And when you describe the tech scene in Berlin now, what is the level of this tech scene? Because there was a presentation of the environmental department here about a digital agenda and what they do on the European level and of course on the German level. And there were a lot of discussions about startups in Berlin and the tech scene here, and it sounds not so good. And therefore I would like to hear what you would say about that.
That's a great question. When you ask about the tech scene in Berlin, what do you mean specifically when you say how is it? What do you mean by that?
Yes, it's of course a general question. When you tech is a huge, of course, a huge impact. I would say the modern thinking or startup scene, or although the general companies or great companies, big companies, about when it come to AI, for example, or machine learning or something around this stuff we discussed at the event. Do you think Berlin is on the first level, or it's something behind, or it's what do you think?
So now I understand what you're asking. I think last year I got to a point where I had so many stories and experiences of my own, as well as of the women that I've come to know and worked with through Frauenloop, and also through the networks that I belong to in tech in Germany, that I wrote, it started as a blog post and then it got picked up on Medium and by people of color in tech UK. And the article was called How to Avoid Terrible Tech Companies. And this was just something that I think I literally wrote in a hotel, some evening that I was traveling for work, and I just had to kind of get out some of the points that were eluding so many women in particular, but also people generally, about the tech scene in Berlin. I think that the frustration that I have about the Berlin tech scene is principally one that has to do with how it is funded and how it is staffed. And so on the funding side, I would say that the majority of startups, what is meant by the term startup and what is implied by the kind of funding structures that allow companies to be quickly set up as a GmbH, companies to hire and do rapid growth and development processes using teams, is very poorly understood by everyone. It's very poorly understood by, in many cases, the entrepreneurs themselves who are looking for investor funding and trying to raise huge amounts of money, debt funding. It's also poorly understood by the people who are hired to work at these startups and who may or may not understand not only what it means if you are working for a relatively new company with a short track record and no real roadmap in sight, but also who don't necessarily understand what their rights are working as an employee who is full-time and in Germany. And I think that, so on the funding side, that's one big gap that has become increasingly urgent in terms of the abuses that I see all the time. On the staffing side, the idea that you have lots of different people with different backgrounds and different experiences chasing a stable German tech job in a German city and not understanding that they may not, in fact, be offered that. And they may not, in fact, get that from a relatively new company with all kinds of loopholes that allow you to fire people if your company has less than 10 employees, for example, or if you declare insolvency and have lots of ways of... Nobody knows this stuff. Mm-hmm. And the people who do know this tend to be German nationals who have read or are in a position to read through the very detailed labor law. Mm. And those are not the people who are working at most of these startups. And those are the people who you'll often hear complaining about and being very cautious about German startups versus established German companies with a track record and maybe a union and maybe a better adherence to the law. Mm. This is really, for me, the big bar with which I now tend to evaluate tech companies in Berlin. Do they try to deal with people fairly? Mm. I understand if they're not being completely transparent about their funding situation. That's quite involved, and it's hard to motivate people if you are dealing with a challenging situation that you yourself as a founder are not necessarily sure how you will navigate. But I also know that, these tech workers who are non-German, who are a very large portion of the Berlin tech scene, they're coming from places like Brazil, which is a mess right now with politically and for lots of underrepresented and marginalized groups. They're coming from places like Venezuela, which we don't hear about anymore, but similarly, it's a mess. Yeah. They're coming from all over the world, and whether it's a perceived rich country or it's a perceived less developed country, they're coming with the intention and the understanding that they will be treated fairly in a German-based company by the laws and the rights and the privileges of the country. Mm. And so in many cases, they're shocked to discover that, their work contract, even if they're working in English for the language of business, their work contract is only in German. I've seen this many times. Okay. So if you're not going to pay a lawyer, or if you're not lucky enough to have a native, fluent German speaker accessible, you have to sign and hope that there's nothing scary in the contract. And a lot of things are like this. It's very hard to navigate what's happening if there seem to be labor laws being broken. People working way too long and way too hard, but there seems to be no mitigating factor. There is no union representative. You can say, hey, is this paid or should I get extra vacation? And so a lot of these kinds of things plague the industry right now, because you have a lot of money being poured into many, many new startups, and the money is often venture capital, and that has a very distinct time frame, which is limited, and that demands a certain amount of return very quickly. So the number of tech workers in Berlin that I've met who know this is few. And the number of tech workers who have seen the effects of this, layoffs unexpectedly, massive expansion, not accompanied by much management or human resources support. Everybody's seen this. This is happening all the time. But the reasons for it and the ways that it might be better managed or even avoided, I don't hear anybody talking about. I don't hear enough people talking about. So that's what I would say the Berlin tech scene is. It's in a phase of rapid growth. There are lots of, I think, government and other business entities that are thrilled because jobs. I met a Berliner who told me it's crazy how real estate is becoming. He was working in real estate because he said, Berlin has always been a place where you could find a place to live. You couldn't find a job. There were no jobs. Now, there are jobs everywhere, and you can't find anywhere to live. It's too expensive.
Yes, it's interesting how it works. Yeah. Yes. On the other hand, the tech, or what you say, AI or machine learning or whatever is of course the future, and we have to create this. And of course there are some danger at the horizon. Is it sustainable? It's the one question, and the other is about the diversity and
is it desirable? That's my question, is always what I like to interject, because at the same time that we want to acknowledge that all types of digitalization can improve and add convenience to the lives of everyone. There are real questions in terms of how machine learning algorithms and or AI, depending on whether it really is artificial intelligence or just machine learning. There are real questions about how it's being implemented in various different parts of the world, including Germany. Yeah. So because we're lucky enough to have an EU Commission that is recommending various high-level reviews and legal options and ways of regulating and not necessarily slowing down, but just shaping the future of digital life in Europe. I think it's a big opportunity, and there's more to the opportunity than just build, and then later they will come. I think there's real proof and a lot of researchers who are weighing in and advocating quite strongly for thinking about the future as more inclusive, one hopes, more engaging, and a more representative and reflective place than the world currently is. And how do we get there? And how do we get there in such a way that, unlike the Berlin tech scene and many other tech scenes, you don't have these signals and symbols that are telling you, older people are not really welcome.
Okay.
Women are not really welcome. Certain nationalities are not really welcome. And these are problems that not just Berlin Tech, but many tech hubs struggle with, and companies then individually struggle with these problems. What we're trying to do with the future of digitalization and AI is to ensure that the whole of society and the techniques and the technologies that become commonplace are not built in a way that signals that the future is not for older people, women, Black, Asian, Arab, Muslim, others, that there are not any on-ramps and there are not any reflections of everyone's human experience in that future. We're trying to avoid having the kind of future that is architected in the same way as the past by a bunch of smart guys who thought about themselves, and they tried to include whoever they had in mind, and they didn't include the people they didn't include. This is what it will be if we rush headlong and just roll out technologies and see. It's not going to be as inclusive as it would be if we include more rather than less social scientists, critical thinkers, legal experts, and others who have as a goal the inclusion of different aspects, different sectors of society. That's not what technologists do in general. And so if we're talking about AI and we want to treat it the same way we treated web development, you have then very feasible and very understandable circumstances where terrible things are implemented in society, and the architects of these terrible things say, well, nobody asked me about what would happen. I just built the thing. And the thing is then becoming a facilitator of circumstances and uses that nobody wants.
Yes, that's right, yes. And this especially, although the question what kind of data will be collected and what kind of algorithm or whatever will be created. And therefore, fully understand and support this, because there was also a discussion during the Berlinale from women around TV and television, because we have a huge amount of AI or other things, and they come the opinion or the experience, I would say, that there are no women reflected in that AI already.
There is a question, I think, that we have to keep coming back to, which is of humanity.
Yes.
Are we looking for artificial intelligence to simulate humanity, or are we looking for artificial intelligence algorithms to optimize and to simplify the human experience in all of its diversity? And this is a really fine point to stay with for a moment, because I think that AI is just like, what did they used to call it? New media. When the web was invented, it was new media. And you had new media jobs, and you had new media managers, and we weren't even using digital. We were talking about new media, and this was all things that had to do with the internet.
Okay.
So now we have, I think, this phase still with AI, thanks to the movies and film and so on. We have a very generalized concept of the singularity, computers taking over and completely independent, if not thought, then at least projections and responses to stimuli. And it's really interesting to think that as much as everyone would like to see flying cars and things running with minimal human involvement, whether those are things at home, Internet of Things type appliances, or we're talking about buses and cars and vans, there's always human involvement at the start. There's always human involvement once you look into where algorithms come from and how they're trained to simulate intelligent decision-making and predictions. They're coming from data. It's human data. It's collected by humans.
Yes.
Hopefully it's cleaned by humans. It's analyzed by humans. And then computer algorithms are trained to match and to predict based on this human-derived data set that's by, and that's for humans. So it's simply an optimization of what analysts used to be able to do over much longer periods of time by going over the same data in much smaller samples and drawing conclusions and extrapolating out what you could conclude and where there were correlations. This is much faster now with computers doing this work, but they're doing this work based on human everything. And human everything means, as we know, these are perspectives, these are opinions. If they're rendered faster, if they are delivered with a much higher degree of confidence, that does not make them any less subjective, and it does not make them any less human-derived, which means there is room for error. There is a lot of room for unconsidered harm. That you were talking about data and the use of data and concern about what kind of data, how much data, where the data is derived from. So the initial Women Take on the Digital Divide event that I organized with the Heinrich Böll Stiftung in the capacity of CEO of Frauenloop. The first event was about ad tech, because online advertising has changed so much from the days of Mad Men and traditional media advertising to what it is today, which not only involves third-party data collection and lots of invasive tracking algorithms that will send you images of a pair of shoes that you looked at once, for days. If you are going from site to site to site, and they will stalk you in the hopes of getting you to click on the advertisement. online. This was a really fascinating talk that was given by Tammy Lasad Anderson, who is now a data privacy advocate after starting as a marketer and a digital strategist. And it was exactly about what people miss when they think about digital ads, when they think about online advertising, and they miss the fact that this goes way beyond selling you a pair of shoes, and the volume of data that is being collected currently by tech companies that purport to give you free browsers or suggest that they are giving you free access to their websites or to their products or their applications. And not only is it being collected, but it's being collected and consolidated, and then algorithms are being trained to predict based on completely unrelated information that's collected just as the consciously given information. This contextual data has gotten to a point where there are real privacy concerns about. I think a good example is one of the cases in the UK where you had some shopper who was browsing through whatever it was they were browsing through, and they suddenly started to receive targeted emails, targeted messages, and the targeted email messages were about pregnancy kits, and they were because the advertiser had purchased information about shoppers, about couponers who were following a coupon or a subscription kind of model, and they were able to collect this and match it to other information about what the person who used this computer or this browser was browsing or looking at, and these were the kinds of correlations that the algorithm, which has no stake in the decision, is completely outside of the human decision making, but these are the kinds of correlations that this algorithm had understood to mean likelihood of being female and likelihood of being pregnant. And so the fact that the person who was involved, I think, was a teen and was not in any way kind of actively seeking this information, to have this proactively pushed on them is hugely invasive and raises lots of questions about what kind of context is being fed potentially to an algorithm that then is going to try to sell you something completely different based on preferences and interests that you in no way consented to give to the third party. That's been tracking you, that's been collecting your data along with data that you did think it was okay to give about your name and your email and so on. And this is really what the Cambridge Analytica folks got into so much trouble about, and this is absolutely what a lot of the problems that we have with some of the biggest social media platforms is about. How are they collecting all this data, and how are they unregulated despite collecting all of this data? Because they're not like an advertising agency, which might be slapped with a fine by one of the broadcasting regulatory bodies that says, oh, you used this kind of language, or you showed this kind of nudity, or something was in some way a transgression that this agency that created these advertisements is responsible for. We've heard from Mark Zuckerberg, nobody's responsible at Facebook for anything that happens. Twitter, same. They are doing their best to try to keep up with the stem of hate and abuse, but they're doing a terrible job. It's not keeping up with the demand, and nobody's really responsible in the end. Nobody wants to take responsibility, and the governments that would otherwise try to set regulations are woefully behind. They're just now trying to catch up and figure out how they can create a framework that at least allows you to look at the problem in terms of the existing laws that we have. These are new problems. Many of the laws have not yet been written, particularly with regard to artificial intelligence or AI. There may not be clear regulations that cover who to blame and how to legislate if something terrible happens that is based on a computer-driven decision. But this for me means that the whole AI story it sounds nice, it's good for fundraising, venture capitalists love to hear about it, but it doesn't necessarily mean we want this in all aspects of our life.
Yes, yeah. Yes, it's very tricky, I would say. Very tricky. But yes, we have now entered a new decade. It's golden 20s, often called. And of course, we want a very sustainable future, a future with humanity, and of course, a future with functional, I would say, AI, and which can perhaps support us and not do the opposite, like you mentioned in the advertising field. What are your visions or suggestions for this new decade? Do you have concrete suggestions or a vision what could be for a good future which include all these new techniques?
Well, I have lots of visions of the bad future, so I will spare you those.
We want the good one.
As far as the good future,
yes.
I think that the push that I'm making right now, which started with the talk that I gave about some personal experiences and hopes in the European Parliament last year, and also the areas that I'm trying to be as active as I can in kind of the immediate legislative horizon, is basically trying to create a GDPR style framework for how to implement AI systems with regard to human processes, with regard to personnel selection processes, with regard to personal and home security processes, with regard to public safety and security processes, with regard to social sector benefits administration and government processes, such as getting your passport or your residence document renewed or created. These are areas that everyone can be touched by, and these are areas that I think it would be worse than naive to leave to private industry to come up with the solutions and see how it works. It would be great to leverage the development capacity and the efficiency of the private sector and balance that with a Europe-wide framework for human rights, civil rights, and how any artificial intelligence-driven process has to be evaluated. And so the evaluation part is what I think more and more I feel is lacking, and I feel needs to be constantly defended, that you cannot create technologies intended for everyday humans and every human to use, ideally, and only include the developers, potentially the government entity or private sector body that has paid for the development, and maybe a handful of target users who may not be very diverse in the creation of these algorithms. You can't, because then you find yourself in a situation where it's not an improvement necessarily or a convenience necessarily for a broad range of people, which is what everyone wants. I mean, I think everyone working in the tech sector is looking for the next not only valuable 100-year unicorn company that they want to develop, but they're trying to develop products everybody needs or everybody perceives as necessary. So that's the case if you're in the private sector, that's the case if you're in government and you want to digitize and create more efficient processes for the public that you serve. Everybody wants technology that works for all. But that's not what you get if you don't create structures where different outliers, because AI and machine learning is all about the norm versus the outliers. So you need to find ways, I think, to ensure that outliers are being included and that someone or several someones is considering how any automation or automated decision-making algorithm is going to affect those who don't fit the norm for whatever reason. And by doing that, you create this sense of inclusion and you create this test process that I think we risk not having. And if you don't test, then we know how that usually goes. So this is the vision I have, is that you have this understanding and acceptance, hopefully, from anyone who's trying to build an algorithm that's going to make decisions faster and easier for humans, on behalf of humans, considers at all time who do they need to bring in. Are they social scientists? Are they community members? Are they legislators? Are they all of the above? But how do they need to test these decision-making algorithms before they take over the jobs and the decision-making of real humans? Yes, so that we can make sure that people are seen and they're treated fairly.
Yes, and that's a wonderful vision. And but on the other hand, a lot of people, normal people, I would call it, they are very scared, afraid of the future, because they think it's perhaps they wouldn't understand it, they cannot use it, or they would be perhaps not treated like they wanted to be treated. Do you have any suggestion how these normal people, not non-tech, I would call them, react or can do for, or can prepare themselves for this future?
How to prepare yourself for an automated future, a highly automated future. I think the question is not how you prepare, because there's nothing to do except engage as fully as possible in your legislative and professional processes that you have access to, because everyone is hearing about this, I think, from all quarters. So you're hearing on the job, we're trying to implement AI in some capacity. So the more information you can get about that, the less likely it is to be a scary future threat, because you will most likely discover that specific optimizations are planned for one type of process in the office or one type of product being produced by the company. And so it's not an overall takeover, no humans necessary. Suddenly we will do everything with AI. That we're not moving that quickly. There's no need to fear that. In terms of the public sector, I think fewer people are aware that the concern there is not necessarily that AI will be introduced into people's lives without warning. The concern there is that AI will take over the kinds of slow, irritating, bureaucratic processes that nobody likes currently, and what will appear to be convenience at first will turn out to be surveillance at worst. So that's what I would be more apt to say is the concern, that citizens and residents of European countries that are concerned about how quickly and how far automation and AI is going to encroach upon their daily lives, inform themselves at the hearings and at the many, many public discussions and debates that are happening, will continue to happen before any of these changes get made. Because a lot of these decisions get made based on who shows up. How much perceived interest there is.
To be part of this.
You have to make your voice heard, and if you don't, then, as I said, you will find more and more with increasing frequency that what seems like it's an improvement in terms of service, in terms of things you can do digitally, quickly can become exclusionary. You can do this and that process online, but not if you don't have a high-speed connection, but not if you're not able to access certain things, but not. So people start to get left behind because the people who are building these algorithms are not thinking about the outliers who may not have access to the same tools and the same process. They are thinking about themselves and building for themselves, as we all do. And if there's no outcry, it may be that it's late to realize after the rollout, this actually disadvantages certain sectors of society. Certain people are not served or not better served by this new digital product as other people are served by this digital product. So it's a fine balance, but engagement, inclusion is how I believe you mitigate the risk, and you also mitigate the fear of being left out. Because really this is what people are concerned about, who are concerned about AI. They don't want to be left out. But I feel like, the leaving out is only if you are not engaged at any level of these decision-making processes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that sounds a good advice. And for me, and I think you too, I love to create this new future. And it's very inspiring, I would say.
I mean, I think globalization is the same, at least from my perspective, globalization is the same as digitization. It's meant to make the world smaller, and it's meant to make us feel more connected as opposed to more isolated and less likely to reach out and feel comfort and community with people who are far away, people who are different from ourselves. And this has always been, especially given where I've come from and how things have developed for me over time, that's always been my conviction that technology is an amazing tool for bringing people together on different levels in reflecting the similarities that we all have, we all share. So when I see that there are processes that distinctly don't help, unhelpful in reinforcing the similarities, I see that there's the big potential to emphasize specific things that are not shared by the majority. That's when I think it's high time to ensure that everyone feels at least empowered to ask questions and to get involved, because that is what will make technology great for everybody.
Wow. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to my podcast, Magic Brain Kicks. I would like to invite you to share this podcast, to give a comment and a like on iTunes. And if you want more information, please visit my website under drmariahovager.com. Hope I will hear you soon, and kick your brain, and goodbye.